Okay, welcome back. We are going to start planes in this video, how we can divide and separate the body into different positions, into different planes. And this is really important because when we look at diagnostic imaging, whether it's MRIs or X-rays or CAT scans or PET scans, it's important to take certain images and pictures in multiple planes. So here on the top left, you can see that we're looking at the human body from front to back. And on this image, we're looking at the body from sideways. And on this view, we are cutting the body in half, giving us a bird's eye view looking down into the body. So when we cut the body in half into left and right halves, we're looking at this plane called a sagittal plane, which will divide the body into a left and right half. When we cut the body across this way from left to right, separating the body into a front and back half this way, that gives us this view. They call it the frontal plane, also known as a coronal plane. Frontal plane or coronal plane. And then we have the transverse plane when we cut the body in half, giving us a bird's eye view. And on many diagnostic films, we need to look at a person in all three, especially when we're looking at masses or tumors, or if we want to see if a cancer or tumor has metastasized and how far it metastasized. If we want to measure a tumor from top to bottom, inside to out, left to right, we need all three views to get a really good image. So here, when we cut the body across this way, we're talking about the transverse plane. When we look at the brain, this is a sagittal. This is the front. This is the back. This is your spinal cord. Here's the tongue. Here's the cerebellum. Here's the medulla, the pons, and the cerebrum. Here's the diencephalon. Here's your thalamus. So this is a sagittal plane. This is the person's left and right. So this is a coronal plane or frontal plane. And then here are the ventricles to look at cerebral spinal fluid. So this is a transverse plane. Here was drag and drop. So what divides the body into an anterior and posterior section? That's the coronal. What divides the body into an equal left and right half? That's called a mid-sagittal. What divides the body into an unequal left and right section? So again, that's going up and down, but it may not be right in the center. Maybe it's off center, so it's parasagittal. That's going to divide the body into an unequal left and right section. So know the difference between mid-sagittal and parasagittal. And then transverse plane divides the body into superior and inferior sections. Okay, now this is an interesting question. It's testing two bits of information, two for the price of one. So what is the medial border of the highlighted region called? Okay, so here's the highlighted region. Now you got to know what is the medial border. All right, so this is lateral border. This would be the superior border. This is the medial border. Okay, and the best choice here would be sagittal or mid-sagittal plane. Okay, sagittal or mid-sagittal plane. Let's look at this one. What is the name of the line that makes the medial border of the highlighted region? Okay, so this is some new terminology, but here's the medial. Now we find this, and it hits this line going up. And if you look at this line going up, it intersects here with the clavicle. So this would be mid-clavicular. Mid-clavicular. Okay. If they were to give you a choice like left hypochondriac, yep, that could be an answer too. Okay, but they're not going to give you both choices. It would probably be one or the other. If they gave you another answer, and they wanted to know what is this line, and you didn't see mid-clavicular, then you would have to find something called parasagittal, right? Because it's separating into unequal left and right side. Okay, so you have to look at all the choices given. Okay, we're getting close here to the end of this lecture, so we're talking about body cavities. And body cavities are designed to protect the organs against accidental shocks. It also allows change in size and shape of some of the internal organs. Let's take a look. We're going to show you the ventral body cavity. We're going to show you how the diaphragm is involved in separating the upper chambers from the lower chambers. So let's look here. Here's anterior, here's posterior, right, or ventral and dorsal. Here's the thoracic cavity. Down here on the bottom, abdominopelvic. So thoracic cavity is made up of a pleural cavity for your lungs and a pericardial cavity for the heart. Then you have your diaphragm. That's going to separate your thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic. We're going to focus primarily on the abdominal and pelvic when we talk about abdominopelvic. What do we have here? This is your cranial cavity. This is your vertebral cavity. Cranial cavity, vertebral cavity. Here is your pleural cavity. We don't see the heart here, so it's just lungs, that's pleural. Here's your diaphragm. And then here is the abdominal cavity. And then here's your pelvic cavity. I've seen questions in the past pop up where you have to drag and drop which cavities are in the dorsal and which is in the ventral, right? So again, ventral is here, dorsal is everything back here. So now, when you think of the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal and the spinal cord and the meninges that protect it, that's all part of the dorsal cavity. The ventral cavity is the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, the mediastinum, and lungs. The mediastinum is right here. The mediastinum is this little space that allows a lot of blood vessels and windpipe and esophagus, all these structures to go through the center here. Okay. So now, to understand the cavities, there's two terms that I want you to really understand. One of them is called visceral, the other is called parietal. Whether we're talking about the lung cavity, which is pleural, whether we're talking about the heart cavity, which is called pericardial, whether we're talking about what's happening in the abdominal, which is called the peritoneum, we always have two layers. If you take your fist and pretend you're pushing it into a balloon, the fist would represent the organ. When the organ makes contact with the inner part of this balloon, this is called the visceral layer, or the visceral, if it's the heart, the visceral pericardium. If it was the lung, it would be called the visceral pleura. If it was in the stomach, it would be called the visceral peritoneum. So visceral always refers to the layer that's making contact with the organ. Now, when you put your fist in the balloon, right, it's a double layer. There's an outer portion. That's the parietal layer. When we're talking about the heart, it's the parietal pericardium. When we're talking about the lungs, it's the parietal pleura. When we're talking about the peritoneum, it's the parietal peritoneum. Okay, so you have visceral and parietal. Between the visceral and the parietal, if it's the heart, it's the pericardial cavity. If it's at the lungs, it's the pleural cavity. And if it's in the gut, it's the peritoneal cavity. So you have a visceral layer, in this case, visceral pericardium, a parietal pericardium, and then a pericardial cavity. So parietal is the outer layer that lines the cavity itself. The visceral covers the organ. So now let's look at the heart. The outer portion is the parietal pericardium, right there. The part that comes into contact with the organ is the visceral pericardium. And then where the pericardial fluid is the pericardial cavity. Remember, that heart is beating, you know, lots, and that muscle generates heat, so the pericardial cavity filled with fluid can help cool it off. Here's the lung, which is pleura. The inner part is called the visceral pleura. Outer part is called the parietal pleura. And then the inner portion between the two is called pleural cavity. The mediastinum I showed you before, that's filled with some blood vessels, the trachea, the esophagus, the thymus, etc. The pleural cavity itself is going to contain both lungs. So what's the highlighted structure here? I'll give you a second to look at it. We see it's the heart. We see it's the blue portion comes into contact with the heart, so it's got to be visceral pericardium. When we talk about the peritoneum, this refers to the lining of the abdominal pelvic cavity. But see, you still see the same words, visceral and parietal. Peritoneum just refers to this that contains all of the digestive organs. So if you see the highlighted structure, which is blue, all the way around, that's going to be parietal peritoneum. If it was visceral peritoneum, it would be like this. It would be going around here, or just going around the liver, or going around the stomach, or just going around the intestine. That would be visceral. Parietal is around the cavity, the entire cavity. Now, notice back here, there's two organs that's not surrounded by this peritoneum. This looks like the kidney, and this is the pancreas. We call that retroperitoneum. It's retroperitoneum. It is behind the peritoneum. It's kept back there, flush. That's why pancreatic cancer is so painful. It's so tight in behind this retroperitoneum. So when that pancreas expands, the peritoneum is highly sensitive. A lot of pain. Okay, so that brings that to a close. Let me see if anyone has